Well, it's kind of strange, you just never know where you're gonna like stumble on a little bit of wisdom.
Yeah.
Lately, I've been looking at this book, and you wouldn't think it'd be a source of business insight.
Okay.
It's called Devotions for Dating Couples.
Oh, wow.
And it's a devotional, so.
Right.
As I was reading it, there were these like seven ideas, core ideas about building really strong relationships, the kind that last. And I don't know, it just struck me like how much these actually apply to, you know, what makes a business successful.
Yeah.
So, kind of a different direction for us today, but I think it'll be a fun deep dive.
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection. I mean, when you think about it, both, relationships and businesses, like the really successful ones, they're both built on so many of the same things,
Right.
like trust and a shared sense of purpose and, just understanding each other.
That's it. Yeah. So we're going to take these seven themes from this devotional and kind of look at how they apply in the business world.
Okay.
We've got building strong business relationships, which is inspired by the idea of love,
Okay.
and then leading with understanding and flexibility, which is inspired by grace.
Interesting.
And then we've got strategic planning and reflection, and that's inspired by the idea of prayer in the book.
Okay.
We'll also look at establishing core values and mission, which is inspired by, God's word,
Right.
and focusing on efficiency in your core offerings. The book ties that into the idea of simplicity.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then we'll look at navigating challenges and moving forward, which is inspired by forgiveness.
Okay.
And last but not least, we've got fostering collaboration and partnerships, and that's inspired by the concept of community.
Wow, there's a lot there.
Yeah, we're gonna look at some examples of, well-known U.S. companies that are really putting these ideas into practice.
Hmm.
And we'll also look at what happens when businesses, kind of forget about these relational principles.
Right, they lose sight of them.
Exactly. Yeah. So, are you ready to see where this takes us?
Yeah, let's jump in.
Okay, so let's start with that first principle.
Yeah.
Building strong business relationships, inspired by the idea of love. So the devotional talks about, actively putting in the effort to make your romantic relationship work.
Hmm.
Showing care and making it a priority. I mean, it seems pretty obvious, right?
Yeah.
But how often do you think businesses really apply that same kind of like focused care to their customers or
Yeah.
employees, even their wider network?
I mean, it's definitely more than, just being polite on the phone or
Yeah,
sending a thank you note or whatever.
yeah.
It's about really investing in those relationships,
Mm-hmm.
putting in the effort to make sure people feel valued and appreciated.
Like a real genuine relationship.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, think about it. When, a relationship is thriving, it's usually because both people are putting in the work
Right.
to care for each other, be there for each other.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with business. When customers feel valued and like you actually care about them,
Mm-hmm.
they're not just going to buy from you once, they'll come back again and again.
Right.
They become like these walking advertisements for your business because they're so happy with how you treat them.
Right. And it's more than just the customers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But what about, your team, the people you're working with every day?
Yeah. I mean, those relationships are just as important.
Yeah.
When your employees feel valued and respected and like they're actually part of something,
Mm-hmm.
positive and meaningful, I mean, that's huge for their engagement,
Right.
They're going to be more motivated, they're going to work better together as a team, and ultimately, they're going to be more productive. It's, just like in their personal lives. If they feel loved and supported,
Right.
they're going to be able to show up as their best selves.
So if a business is really doing this well, like consistently,
Mm-hmm.
what's the big picture result?
Well, I mean, when you have a company that's known for treating both its employees and its customers really well,
Right.
and for operating with integrity, I mean, that builds a really powerful brand reputation.
Mm-hmm.
People start to see you as this trustworthy and reliable company.
Yeah.
And that attracts new customers, it attracts talented employees,
Mm.
and it even helps you, build strong partnerships with other businesses.
So like a ripple effect almost.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, when you have a couple who are known for being kind and generous and supportive,
Mm.
they tend to attract other people like that into their lives.
That's a good analogy. So now let's flip that and think about what happens when a business kind of neglects those relationship building fundamentals.
Right.
What are the downsides there?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest things you see is what's called customer churn,
Mm-hmm.
which is basically just a fancy way of saying that customers are leaving,
Right.
they're going to your competitors because they feel like those competitors value them more.
Right.
It's like a relationship breaking down because one person feels ignored or like their needs aren't being met.
Right. Right. And on the employee side, I mean, a negative work environment,
Yeah.
a lack of care, that's got to have some pretty serious consequences too, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, employee turnover is a huge one.
Mm-hmm.
People are much more likely to leave a job if they don't feel valued or supported.
Yeah.
And when you have employees constantly coming and going, that's really costly for a business.
Mm-hmm.
You have to spend all this time and money on recruiting and training new people,
Yeah.
and you lose all that institutional knowledge that those employees built up over time.
Right, right. And then there's, public perception of the brand.
Yeah.
What about that?
Well, I mean, if a company gets a reputation for, having terrible customer service
Yeah.
or for engaging in unethical practices
Mm-hmm.
or even just being difficult to work with, that can really tarnish their image.
Right.
It makes it a lot harder to attract new customers and talented employees.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, if a couple gets a reputation for being rude or unpleasant,
Right.
people are going to avoid them.
So are there any like specific companies that come to mind in terms of companies that really do this well?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of great examples out there,
Okay.
but one that always comes to mind is Zappos.
Oh yeah, Zappos.
I mean, their whole business model is basically built around providing exceptional customer service.
Mm-hmm.
They really empower their employees to go above and beyond to make customers happy.
Mm.
And that creates these like incredibly positive experiences that lead to some serious customer loyalty.
And then there's Southwest Airlines.
Right.
I mean, they seem to have this really loyal following.
Yeah, they've definitely cultivated a really fun and positive company culture.
Yeah.
And that translates directly into how they interact with their customers.
Mm-hmm.
Their employees are known for being friendly and approachable.
Yeah.
And that makes the whole, flying experience a lot more enjoyable.
Yeah. Less stressful for sure.
Exactly. It makes it feel more personal and less like you're just a number to them.
And then there's Chick-fil-A. They always get, top marks for customer service.
Yeah, they're definitely known for being polite and efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And they invest a lot in training their employees to, make sure every customer feels valued.
Right.
It's those little details, like a genuine smile or remembering someone's order
Right.
that make a difference.
So what about the companies that don't get this right? What are some like red flags to look out for?
Well, one thing that's always a bad sign is if a company has a really difficult or frustrating return policy,
Right.
or if their customer support seems like it's designed to, avoid actually helping you.
Right.
Those are pretty clear signs that they don't really care about their customers.
Yeah. Yeah. And then how about how companies treat their employees?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big one too.
Mm-hmm.
If you're hearing about, high levels of burnout or a really negative work culture,
Mm-hmm.
that's a sign that the company isn't prioritizing its employees.
Right.
And that can really hurt their productivity and their ability to innovate.
And those companies that maybe, cut corners ethically
Yeah.
or just aren't quite as honest as they should be.
Yeah, I mean, those companies might see short-term gains,
Right.
but in the long run, they're almost always going to lose the trust of their customers.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're listening to this and you're, thinking about your own business or your career, what's the main takeaway here in terms of building strong relationships?
Well, I think it really comes down to this.
Okay.
You have to genuinely care about the people you interact with, whether they're your customers, your colleagues, your partners.
Mm-hmm.
It's about investing in your employees, giving them the support they need to succeed,
Yeah.
and creating a work environment where they feel valued.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about being ethical and transparent in everything you do so that people can trust you.
Right, right. So just like in any relationship, you got to put in the effort
Exactly.
to make it work.
Yeah. It's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
But it's definitely worth it.
Okay, so moving on to our second principle, and this one draws inspiration from the idea of grace. And I should say we're not talking about, a strictly religious definition here,
Right.
but more about that spirit of, understanding and flexibility
Okay.
when we interact with other people.
So like extending that same kind of grace that we hope to receive ourselves.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So in the devotional, it talks about, grace often involves extending understanding and, unearned favor.
Right.
I mean, how does that translate to the business world, do you think?
Well, I think in a business context, leading with grace means that leaders and organizations are willing to be empathetic and flexible
Mm.
and really try to understand and accommodate the needs of, both their team and their customers.
Right, right. So what are some of the tangible benefits of leading with that kind of understanding and flexibility?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest ones is that it fosters innovation.
Mm-hmm.
When employees feel like they can make mistakes without being, harshly punished, they're
Right.
much more likely to take risks and try new things.
Yeah.
And that's really important for any business that wants to stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah, yeah. And how does that grace, that understanding, how does that affect your relationship with customers?
Well, when you're willing to be understanding with customers when they face issues
Mm-hmm.
and offer them flexible solutions,
Yeah.
like maybe a lenient return policy or a willingness to make exceptions, or
Mm.
even just taking the time to really listen to their concerns, I mean, that builds a lot of goodwill.
Yeah.
It makes customers feel like you actually care about them, and that makes them much more likely to do business with you again in the future.
And for the team internally, how does that affect the dynamics of the team?
Well, when leaders are empathetic and flexible in how they manage their teams,
Mm-hmm.
it creates a much more supportive and collaborative environment.
Yeah.
People feel like they can be themselves
Yeah.
and they're not afraid to speak up or share their ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to, stronger team cohesion, better communication,
Mm.
just a more positive and productive work environment overall.
Now let's think about what happens when leaders or companies aren't understanding or flexible.
Right.
What are some of the pitfalls there?
Well, I mean, if you have a really rigid and unforgiving work environment,
Mm-hmm.
that can really stifle creativity and innovation.
Right.
People are going to be afraid to step outside their comfort zone
Yeah.
or suggest new ideas because they're worried about being punished for making mistakes.
Right.
So it creates this kind of culture of fear.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the customer side, what happens when there's a lack of flexibility?
Well, companies that are inflexible and don't really seem to care about customer issues,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're going to alienate their customers.
Right.
Nobody wants to deal with a company that makes it really difficult to get help or that isn't willing to, work with them when things go wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you have that kind of demanding, inflexible leadership style, I mean, what does that do to the people who work there?
Yeah, I mean, it can lead to a lot of stress and low morale.
Mm-hmm.
People can feel micromanaged and undervalued,
Right.
and they can end up feeling burnt out, which is
Mm.
obviously not good for anyone.
So thinking about some companies that get this right, that lead with this kind of grace and understanding,
Hmm.
are there any that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, Netflix is one that often gets mentioned.
Okay. Yeah.
They're known for having really flexible work policies,
Mm-hmm.
and they really trust their employees to get their work done.
Right.
They're not micromanaging them or breathing down their necks.
Yeah. Yeah. What about a company like Amazon?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a huge company,
Right.
and they have high expectations for their employees.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also known for being pretty flexible when it comes to resolving customer issues.
Right.
They'll often go above and beyond to make things right,
Mm-hmm.
and that creates a lot of customer loyalty.
And then there's Google, which,
Right.
I mean, famously, they have a very employee-friendly environment.
Yeah, they're known for offering a lot of perks and flexibility.
Right.
They recognize that their employees have different needs and work styles,
Mm-hmm.
and they try to create an environment where everyone can thrive.
Now let's think about some of the companies that maybe missed the mark on this.
Right.
What are some telltale signs?
Well, one of the biggest ones is if the leaders are micromanagers,
Mm-hmm.
if they're constantly looking over their employees' shoulders and not giving them any autonomy,
Right.
that creates a really stifling environment where people are afraid to take initiative.
Yeah. Yeah. And those customer service experiences that we all dread,
Right.
where, the customer service representative is just reading from a script
Mhm.
and they're not empowered to actually help you.
Yeah, that's definitely a sign that the company isn't prioritizing customer satisfaction.
Yeah. Yeah. And then what about a company with a really strict and unforgiving disciplinary culture?
Yeah, that can be really damaging to morale.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
When people are constantly worried about being punished for making mistakes,
Right.
they're less likely to be creative and innovative.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So how can someone listening to this, practically apply this principle of leading with understanding and flexibility
Hmm.
in their own work?
Well, I think it starts with creating a culture of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Making sure that your employees feel like they can come to you with problems
Yeah.
and that you're going to be supportive.
Right.
And it also means being willing to be flexible, to understand that things don't always go according to plan
Mm-hmm.
and that sometimes you need to make exceptions.
Yeah. Yeah. Be human.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And remember that mistakes are inevitable
Mm-hmm.
and they're actually a great opportunity for learning and growth.
So let's move on to our third principle here.
Okay.
And this one takes inspiration from prayer,
Yep.
but the business parallel that we're going to look at is strategic planning and reflection.
Interesting.
So in a lot of contexts, prayer involves taking time to reflect,
Mm.
to seek guidance, and to connect with something bigger than yourself.
Mm.
So in the business world, that translates pretty directly to the importance of strategic planning, looking ahead, setting goals, and then also reflecting, looking back and seeing, what worked, what didn't work, that
Yeah.
sort of thing. So what are some of the benefits of building that time in?
Well, it's just like prayer can provide clarity and direction.
Mm,
In your personal life, strategic planning can do the same thing for a business.
okay.
It helps you define your goals,
Yeah.
understand your position in the market,
Mm-hmm.
and develop a roadmap for the future.
Right.
So it gives everyone in the company, from the CEO to the, entry-level employees,
Right.
a shared sense of purpose and direction.
Okay. Okay. And the reflection aspect, why is that so important in business?
Well, it's important because it allows you to step back from the day-to-day operations
Mm-hmm.
and really take a critical look at how things are going.
Okay.
It helps you identify potential problems early on before they become major issues. And it also helps you spot opportunities that you might otherwise miss.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really important part of, continuous improvement.
So this process of planning and reflecting, how does that impact the decisions that a company makes?
Well, when you're making decisions based on careful thought and analysis,
Mm-hmm.
you're much more likely to make good decisions.
Okay.
You're not just reacting to whatever crisis is in front of you at the moment.
Right.
You're
Yeah.
making decisions that are aligned with your long-term goals.
Now, what can happen when companies don't do this, when they neglect this kind of strategic thinking?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest dangers is that they can end up just drifting aimlessly.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really sure where they're going.
Right.
They're just reacting to whatever comes up.
Yeah.
And that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. Yeah. What about if they're not reflecting on their past performance or market trends?
Yeah. I mean, that's a big mistake, too,
Mm-hmm.
if you're not learning from your mistakes.
Yeah.
And you're not paying attention to what's happening in the market.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to miss out on opportunities.
Yeah.
And you're going to be more vulnerable to threats.
Yeah. Yeah. And how does the lack of strategic thinking affect how a company uses its resources?
Well, if you don't have a clear understanding of your priorities,
Mm-hmm.
you're much more likely to waste resources.
Right.
You might invest in projects that don't really align with your goals,
Mm-hmm.
or you might hire people who aren't the right fit for your company.
So are there any U.S. companies that come to mind when you think about companies that are really good at strategic planning and reflection?
Yeah. I mean, one that always stands out is Apple.
Okay.
I mean, they're known for their long-term vision
Right.
and their meticulous product development process.
Mm.
They really take the time to think about what the market is going to want in the future,
Yeah.
and then they develop products that meet those needs.
What about a more established company, like a really big, well-known company?
Yeah, I mean, Procter & Gamble's a good example.
Okay.
They're known for their really rigorous strategic planning process.
Mm-hmm.
They're constantly analyzing market trends and consumer behavior
Right.
and using that data to inform their decisions.
So they're not just going with their gut.
No, they're definitely data-driven.
Okay. Okay.
Mm.
And what about a company that's maybe a little bit more disruptive, a little bit more innovative?
Yeah, I mean, Tesla's a good example of that.
Okay.
They have these really ambitious goals,
Mhm.
and they're constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Right.
And they're also really good at reflecting on their successes and failures
Mm-hmm.
and using that information to improve.
Okay. Okay. So let's think about the companies that maybe don't do this as well.
Right.
What are some common mistakes that you see?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest mistakes is being too focused on short-term gains.
Right.
You know, some companies are so focused on making a quick buck
Yeah.
that they don't take the time to develop a long-term vision,
Right, right.
and that can really hurt them in the long run.
And what about those companies that just don't take the time to analyze their performance or get feedback from their customers?
Yeah, I mean, that's another big mistake.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not tracking your metrics and
Yeah.
you're not listening to your customers,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to know what's working and what's not.
Right, right. And making big decisions, without really thinking them through.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a recipe for disaster.
Mm-hmm.
You need to take the time to gather information,
Right.
analyze your options,
Mm-hmm.
and consider all the potential consequences before you make a major decision.
So for our listeners, what are some practical ways that they can apply this idea of strategic planning and reflection to their own work?
Well, I think the most important thing is to make time for it.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Schedule it into your calendar,
right.
even if just for 30 minutes a week.
Yeah.
Take some time to think about your goals.
Your progress
Yeah.
and what you need to do to achieve your objectives.
Okay. And don't be afraid to ask for help.
Hmm.
Talk to your mentors.
Yeah.
Talk to your colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
Get feedback from your customers.
Right.
The more input you can get, the better.
Okay, so we're moving on to our fourth principle now.
Okay?
And this one's inspired by the concept of God's word.
Mm.
And the parallel we're going to look at in business is establishing strong core values and a clear mission statement.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So just like, Scripture can serve as a set of guiding principles.
Mm-hmm.
A company's core values and mission statement are really the foundation that the whole business is built on.
Right.
So what are the key benefits of having those clearly articulated?
Well, I mean, first of all, it gives everyone in the company a shared understanding of what the company stands for, what its purpose is and what its values are.
Right.
And that can be really powerful in terms of creating a strong company culture and attracting and retaining top talent.
Right. So how do those values, how do they actually impact the decisions that are being made within a company?
Well, they provide a framework for decision making.
Mm-hmm.
When employees are faced with a difficult decision,
Yeah.
they can always ask themselves, what would our company do in this situation?
Mm-hmm.
What are our values?
Right.
And that can help them make the right choice.
And when it comes to attracting the right people,
Yeah.
I mean, both employees and customers,
Mhm.
how do those values come into play there?
Well, people are more likely to want to work for or do business with a company
Mm-hmm.
that they share values with.
Right.
If you're passionate about sustainability,
Yeah.
you're going to be more attracted to a company that's also committed to sustainability.
So what happens when a company doesn't have these principles in place?
Yeah, I mean, that can be a real problem.
Mm-hmm.
It could lead to a lot of confusion and inconsistency. Different departments might be making decisions that are at odds with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the company might end up sending mixed messages to its employees and its customers.
Yeah. And what about the risk of ethical issues or even reputational damage?
Yeah, that's definitely a concern.
Mm-hmm.
If a company doesn't have a clear set of ethical values,
Yeah.
it's much more likely to make decisions that are, unethical or even illegal.
Right.
And that can really damage the company's reputation.
So how does the lack of a strong mission and values affect the company's brand?
Well, it can make it really hard to create a strong brand identity.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not clear about what you stand for,
Yeah.
it's going to be hard to communicate that to your customers.
Right. So are there any U.S. companies that come to mind that are really doing a good job of operating according to their stated values and mission?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of great examples out there.
Okay.
But one that always comes to mind is Patagonia. They're really committed to environmental sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
And that commitment is evident in everything they do,
Yes.
from the products they make to the way they run their business.
What about REI?
Yeah, REI is another good example.
Okay.
Their mission is to inspire, educate, and equip people for a lifetime of outdoor adventure.
Mm-hmm.
And they really live that mission. They offer a wide range of outdoor gear and apparel. They have a really knowledgeable staff.
Mm-hmm.
And they offer a lot of educational programs and events.
And a company with a strong focus on social impact.
Yeah, Ben and Jerry's is a good example.
Yeah.
They're really committed to social justice,
Hmm.
and they use their business to promote their values.
Right.
They donate a portion of their profits.
It's well, it's kind of strange, you just never know where you're gonna like stumble on a little bit of wisdom.
Yeah.
Lately, I've been looking at this book, and it's you wouldn't think it'd be a source of business insight.
Okay.
It's called Devotions for Dating Couples.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, it's a devotional, so,
Right.
as I was reading it, there were these like seven ideas, core ideas about building really strong relationships, the kind that last. And I don't know, it just struck me like how much these actually apply to, you know, what makes a business successful.
Yeah.
So, kind of a different direction for us today, but I think it'll be a fun deep dive.
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection. I mean, when you think about it, both, relationships and businesses, like the really successful ones, they're both built on so many of the same things,
Right.
like trust and a shared sense of purpose and, just understanding each other.
That's it. Yeah. So we're going to take these seven themes from this devotional and kind of look at how they apply in the business world.
Okay.
We've got building strong business relationships, which is inspired by, the idea of love,
Okay.
and then leading with understanding and flexibility, which is inspired by grace.
Interesting.
And then we've got strategic planning and reflection, and that's inspired by the